Hi, everyone. And I want to welcome you to this first of two meetings on the resurgence of the far right in Canada. We're really happy that you are joining us for these very important discussions. My name is Todd Gordon, and I'm an editor of Midnight Sun and an author of an article in that publication on the far right's resurgence called Fascism is as Canadian as the Maple Leaf. And I'm also one of the organizers for today's events, and I live in Toronto. So this event is being hosted by Alberta Advantage, Briarpatch, Upping the Ante, and Midnight Sun. And it is also endorsed by Between the Lines and Canadian Dimension. So in today's meeting, we're going to look at why we're seeing the resurgence of the far right now, and who and what are driving it, and its social and political impact on us and on the Canadian political landscape. The second meeting, just to give you a heads up now, and I'll give you another reminder later, but the second meeting is going to be May 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's going to focus explicitly on building the movement against the far right, on questions of strategy, tactics, and strengthening our side. We'll be sending out more information about that meeting in the next couple of weeks, but you can add it to your calendar now. So that's May 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So a couple points about our format today before we go any further. So first, it's being recorded and live streamed. We plan on making the recording available for folks who are unable to make it today. Because we're using the webinar format, no one besides myself and the other speakers, Sarah and Cam, are visible. This also means that attendees won't be able to verbally ask questions or to make comments. We'll be using the question and answer function. So if you have questions or comments, you can submit them that way, and there are event organizers who will be monitoring the question and answer for your comments and questions. And we won't use people's names when reading out the questions or comments, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions and comments as we can. So I'm going to give an introduction to the discussion and say a few words about the far right's resurgence. But first, I just want to quickly introduce our other speakers. We have Sarah Jama, who is based in Hamilton, and Cam Scott, who is based in Winnipeg. And thanks to both Sarah and Cam for joining us today. I'll give a bit more of an introduction to them before they both present. So the first thing we should note here when discussing the far right and its white supremacist and reactionary politics is that we are, all of us, on Indigenous land today. Canada is a settler colonial society founded on a project of white supremacy, and Canada's ongoing existence is predicated on that racist and colonial project. A militarized project of dispossession and the denial of sovereignty to Indigenous peoples. And so any discussion of the far right in Canada should be grounded in that long arc of Canadian history, which of course shapes its present. And that history is fertile ground for reactionary racist politics and movements, of which the far right is one manifestation. So the so-called Freedom Convoy has obviously raised the profile of Canada's far right and potentially reshaping Canada's political landscape in important ways. It was the biggest protest organized by the far right in Canada since the 1930s, and has obviously offered momentum and inspiration for far right forces in the country. We can't predict the future, but we shouldn't underestimate the opportunity for them to grow over the next little while, and also to become more radical as well, and possibly to pull conservatives, what we'll call mainstream or conservative party members, to the right, especially if the People's Party continues to grow. So the spark for the Freedom Convoy was, of course, the vaccine mandates, but there's a wider historical context to this that we shouldn't lose sight of. And so I want to make a few points before, just by way of introduction, before turning it over to Cam and Sarah. So first is, how do we characterize the far right and fascists? I see the far right as a sort of continuum that includes fascists, but also those who occupy the space between fascists and mainstream conservatives. They have a more aggressively racist, colonial, transphobic, anti-union, and anti-liberal politics than mainstream conservatism is normally willing to openly endorse. This can be a fluid and often includes folks who will end up as fascists after spending time in this milieu, but aren't necessarily fully fascists when they enter the far right. Fascists themselves would share the aggressively racist, colonial, transphobic, anti-union, and anti-liberal politics of the far right, but their racism and xenophobia and their anti-Semitism, or their commitment to imperialism and so on, is not, I would argue, what necessarily distinguishes fascists from the rest of the right, or even for that matter from liberals. Even if fascists offer a sort of more extreme variation on these things, the liberal tradition has all of those things: racism, homophobia, colonialism, and so on in its history. And it's not even necessarily this sort of authoritarian support for an authoritarian political project that specifically distinguishes fascists, as again, both liberals and conservatives more generally also have a long record of supporting authoritarianism. So I think one key thing that distinguishes fascism for us to be thinking about is its commitment, which we saw with the Freedom Convoy, and we've seen in the sort of couple of years prior building up to it, is commitment to a building a mass-based and openly violent street movement. I would say that that is central to the being of fascists. Fascists may participate in elections, but they don't do so as an end in and of itself. For them, power is ultimately decided by force in the streets, and that should shape our thinking in terms of both how we understand it, but also how we respond to it. I also want to add that fascism is a largely middle-class movement, or in classical Marxist language, a sort of petty bourgeois movement. That doesn't mean that people from other class backgrounds don't ever support fascism, but its bulwark, its core, and I would argue its ideological disposition, as we're seeing in formation now, is very much shaped by an increasingly precarious middle class. So I'm thinking here of small business owners, who themselves, of course, are capitalists, farmers, middle and upper management, self-employed professionals, and the military. So the far right in general, and fascists in particular, exist outside periods of deep and sustained capitalist crisis. And we shouldn't forget that. They don't just disappear when those crises abate, but they do tend to flourish in those periods. And it's also important to note that while capitalists or the bourgeoisie may generally not identify with fascists, and often they will see them as kind of crude or boorish, unhelpful to their own particular agenda. In those places where fascists have come to power, they've done so with the support of those countries' ruling class. It may be that some capitalists are more supportive of fascists and more supportive of fascist power than are others, but I'd argue it's not the case that there were sections of the bourgeoisie who you could say were opposed to fascists in a context of deep crisis and instability, and a crisis in which the ruling elites proved unable to reassert control over the working class and the poor on their own. And fascists, whatever they may say, also are not, we shouldn't take them to be anti-capitalists. In many respects, they're very, very militant and committed defenders of the capitalist order, even if at times they will direct their ire at larger capitalists. That doesn't mean that they are anti-capitalist. So I'm not going to go into depth on the history of the far right and fascist movements in Canada. I will note, though, that it's not a new phenomenon, what we're seeing today. In every period, and this is important to remember, in every period of deep and sustained crisis, capitalist crisis in Canada, the 1930s, the 1970s, the early 1990s. In every such period, there has been a growth of the far right and of fascist organizations and of their street-based presence. And as well, I think you can trace this pattern as well. You see the role of what I described as the middle class central in the formation and the growth of these fascist movements in these periods of crisis. Canada in the 1930s was full of some small and some, such as in Quebec, quite large fascist movements across the country. And that is true again in the 1970s and the 1990s. In all of these periods too, you could find fascists in the Canadian military. So if people follow the news, you know that the last few years, every several months or so, there's another news article about, oh, some more fascists have been discovered, or supporters of the alt-right or what have you have been discovered in the Canadian military. Well, and media and the military will treat it as a bit of a shock. They're shocked by it, and they plan to do something about it. Well, the truth is the presence of fascists in the Canadian military go back to the 1930s, and in every period of crisis where you see fascists grow, you see their presence in the military. And as I note in my article, a military member who taught physical training at the Royal Military College actually trained the paramilitary wing of Quebec fascists in the 1930s. In the early 1990s, it was neo-Nazis who were responsible for the so-called Somalia affair, in which Somalis were beaten, tortured, and murdered by Canadian peacekeepers. And a subsequent investigation into the affair unearthed support for fascism amongst Canadian soldiers that was fairly widespread. And also that officers actually knew about this. It wasn't a secret. So there's a long history of that military connection that we should be alert to when we see new news articles, and we'll see them in the future as well, about more fascists being found in the Canadian military. It's also worth noting that the connection of the far right to more mainstream conservative parties is not new in Canada. In the 1930s, the R.B. Bennett Conservative Party worked with and for a time funded or offered money to the Quebec fascist movement led by Adrian Arcand. Fascists have also organized and, at least for a time, were welcomed into the Social Credit Party in Ontario and Alberta and British Columbia, as well as the Reform Party, which was a conservative party that eventually merged to help form the current Conservative Party in the 1990s. And the neo-Nazi Heritage Front of the late 80s, early 1990s actually organized security for the Heritage Front, for the Reform Party and its leader, Preston Manning, as they tried to move into Ontario to grow their party in Ontario. And of course, Mackenzie King, not a conservative, a liberal, fawned over Hitler after meeting him in 1937. So the connection between mainstream parties and fascists, and some of which you're seeing today with the Conservative Party and its orientation to the Convoy, is also not a new phenomenon. So if we turn to the present moment, obviously COVID-19 and vaccine mandates have animated the current far-right mobilization, which began a couple of years ago with what became weekly marches in a number of cities across the country. Some of which over time started to grow violent. But the volatilities that are driving this moment go back, I'd argue, to 2008 and the global capitalist crisis, which I thought was the biggest capitalist crisis on a global scale since the Great Depression. And then that ushered in a period of fairly deep and sustained stagnation since the initial crisis. Canada and the global order has been in what's referred to as a sort of economic stagnation or a global slowdown. And so as a result, we've seen increasing economic precarity, which obviously affects workers, but also for the petty bourgeoisie or the middle class as well. And then you add into the mix 2 decades of the war on terror and state-sponsored Islamophobia, and the sort of reactionary responses in some quarters to the Black Lives Matter movement. And you have a potential breeding ground, not just for conservative reaction, but increasingly further right and more militant reaction. And so it's not an accident, I would argue, that since 2008, we've seen a significant growth of far-right movements around the world, including fascist movements from the United States to Brazil to India to pretty much all across Europe. But in Canada, the far-right response was actually a little bit delayed. And that's, I would argue, because Canadian capitalism wasn't hit as hard by the 2008 crisis as the sort of rhythms of capitalist accumulation and crisis, the boom and bust rhythms of the Canadian economy, aren't exactly parallel to that of the United States or Europe. But Canadian capitalism since 2008, and especially since 2014, actually has been fairly stagnant. And many of the contradictions of a crisis-prone economy have been mounting. Persistently low corporate profits, persistently low economic growth, and increasing household and business indebtedness. Canada has one of the highest rates of indebtedness for businesses and households in the world today, or in the advanced capitalist, so-called advanced capitalist countries, the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So indebtedness has worsened for many through the pandemic as well, especially for small businesses who have been hit very hard. And so the first clear window that opened up for the far right in Canada in this sort of new period was probably 2015 to 2018, as those crisis tendencies were beginning to mount, and Donald Trump used his presidency, or his campaign and then his presidency, to spew his very racist, xenophobic, and Islamophobic politics, inspiring far-right folks and giving them more confidence and to be more public in their politics in the United States and here. That window in the Canadian context tended to close, with some exceptions, around 2018 or so. But temporarily so. And I would say the pandemic has really smashed that window back open. And as I said earlier, it's been building for a couple of years. But again, to stress the point, the far right's resurgence is deeper than the pandemic. As emboldened as it is, the far right's not going to disappear with the end of the COVID mandates. How it'll play out, of course, we'll see. We're not going to make those predictions here, but we'll see. And it also depends in part on how we progressives respond to the rising tide of the far right. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to our two other speakers, Cam and Sarah. And so our first speaker is Cam Scott. And Cam is a writer and organizer from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. His books include Roman's Snowmare and Vanishing Signs, which are coming out this year from Arbeiter Ring Books. And his article, What Was the Freedom Convoy, was published on Canadian Dimension. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cam.
Thank you so much, Todd, and I'm thankful for Sarah and all the organizers of this event. As said, my name is Cam Scott. I'm speaking to you from Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Métis Nation, where I'm a member of the Communist Party of Canada, Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, and many other coalitions and groups trying to think about anti-fascism in this conjuncture. I'll dip in and out a little bit of that article in Canadian Dimension that Todd mentioned, and riff on that as we launch into this urgent conversation, as an emboldened far right is gaining ground, literally and figuratively. On one hand, commandeering civic spaces, as we saw in February. On the other hand, attaining to a kind of respectability and prominence in the official political spectrum, either as the People's Party or a growing fraction of the Conservatives. There's obviously a great deal of traffic back and forth between these tandem developments, between a racist grassroots, though I hesitate to use the word because of its organic pretense, and the official political representation of capital. I think because the convoy activated a lot of people in its apparent permissiveness or eclecticism, recruiting from all corners of the anti-vaccine movement, in spite of its far right motivators and funders. I think it's really important to account for the convoy's material basis, because the superficial heterogeneity obscures its political character. It's banally true that the agency of capital looks like a chaos of essentially self-interested participants on the ground very often. But there is an agenda. So I think that several related mistakes issue from this empirical confusion about the nature of the convoy. One, most obviously, the perception that it was an authentic, spontaneous working class expression, misdirected. Two, a tactical envy of the convoy, where some commentators in the social movements have actually proposed that the left is being outflanked by a populist right, essentially competing for the allegiance, a fictive every person. And lastly, I think because this characterization of the convoy drastically overstates the diversity of its participants. We find people who are ironically commending this flare-up of the new right for its inclusivity. And I think that the strategies that would follow from this misperception actually endanger working class people of color in their own communities and movements. So the framework for today's event is doubtlessly the correct one. Rather than enviously asking, what can we learn from the Freedom Convoy and trying to construct a left populist movement from the most changeable fraction of a reactionary trend, we're asking, what do we do about the Freedom Convoy and its frightening futurity, the sequences that it connects? What was the convoy that it could effectively recruit from the present? And I think if we answer that question with some specificity, we'll be able to think about how we can oppose a fascist wave in Canada that has far deeper roots than its recent manifestations. So, to my view, the deceptively chaotic inclusivity of the Freedom Convoy already comprises an exemplary instance of class collaborationism, such has been fundamental to colonial nationcraft across the territories that become Canada. In spite of the timely bugbear of vaccine mandates, the convoy has this specifically racialist character, and so do the many processes by which capitalism developed in Canada. So I think it's important to identify which class interests are ascendant in this movement too, because many participants in the convoy wouldn't identify with the characterization of the movement as flagrantly white supremacist. I think it's good also to provide a theory of how white supremacy actually underwrites libertarian individualism in this colonial situation. Then we can speak to how lumpen and ruling class interests are collated in a crisis. So the convoy organizers head for head have compelling links to the far right, and have been testing out different vehicles for a movement like this for a long time before COVID-19. White supremacist Pat King, comes to prominence as a leader of the convoy. Before this, his pandemic activism entailed infiltrating remote First Nations as a kind of anti-vax missionary. And we've all seen his disturbing diatribes on social media about the depopulation of the white race and so on. Like any quest to make Canada great again, this necessarily fantasizes, this prosperous, cohesive past and represses the present reality of colonialism. I'd echo that homegrown white supremacy tends to thrive downstream of imperialism and military adventurism. So before the warm rapport of local law enforcement with the convoy, we should note the presence of RCMP and Canadian Armed Forces, members of Joint Task Force 2, this elite counterterrorism unit that's been accused of war crimes in Afghanistan, has facilitated a coup in Haiti. You name it, their crimes are largely unreported, but assured, given the criminal nature of the interventions in which they participate. So, in a sense, these actors are only bringing the war home. And of course, Canada's ruinous foreign policy will engender right-wing political cultures domestically. This presence does, I want to point out, also strengthen a perception of the Freedom Convoy as a self-styled coup however hapless, as does the original Memorandum of Understanding that Canada Unity drafted as the convoy set out. It didn't only call for the end of vaccine mandates, it called for the dispatch of the government, for the establishment of a new government. The Citizens of Canada Committee, which would be like members of the convoy and the Senate. And it seems a little funny on the face of it, but this phony legalism, I think, too, is characteristic of the right-wing democratic coup, which is accompanied always by street violence. So at this early stage in the progress of the convoy, its political faction, which includes very few truckers, is making pretty much baseless claims to represent a variety of interests against the mandates. But by their own admission, it's a coalition of employers and employees, of businesses. So class collaborationist by design. And I think that the people that claim that the convoy is working class broadly are quite outnumbered and outvoiced still, but it persists. Even so, migrant organizations, social justice groups, pretty much the entirety of organized labor, including Teamsters, Canadian Trucking Alliance, denounced the convoy as harmful to the interests of the working class and harboring racism. This was self-evidently a small business lobby on wheels, comprised of variously solvent owner-operators and libertarian entrepreneurs. These aren't big capitals for the most part, but they certainly aren't workers. It's a movement, I'll reiterate, of what Marxists refer to as the petty bourgeoisie. It's a quasi-class, capitalist on one side and working class on the other, the edges of which have grown a little blurry with the extension of credit to larger sections of the population in the neoliberal era. But classically, the petty bourgeoisie encapsulates small-scale producers who retain some self-earned private property and are able to sell the products of their labor at a better rate, or typically like small to medium scale employers. So this, in a nutshell, is these are the class correlates of the anti-vax and mandate movements, as well as the Freedom Convoy's major donors. Small businesses whose margins suffered during pandemic restrictions. The 2021 fourth quarter survey of Statistics Canada, I do write about this, says that more than 20% of businesses with fewer than 20 employees couldn't take on any more debt. The additional context I point up here is that small business accounts for more than 98% of all Canadian employer businesses. That's like 2/3 of the total labor force. So to put it simply, these small capitals are nonetheless bosses, and their difficulty implies worse for workers. For workers, a vaccine mandate could be an obstacle to employment. For business owners, the mandate first and foremost impacts their ability to requisition labor power. Most anti-mandate protesters were worried about the loss of consumer liberties. Hair salons and bars became these politically contested sites. But if this is about goods and services, for the small capitalist, the most important commodity withheld them during the pandemic is the capacity of others to work. So, this clarity is important. I think it's important to note that following R. Palma Dutt, important theorist of fascism, fascism might originate from the petty bourgeoisie, and it might direct a lot of energy toward attracting them, pitting them against the working class and against financial capital. But fascism isn't an independent movement of the petty bourgeoisie. It isn't a movement of like a self-sufficient middle class as an independent political interest. It's a capitalist movement that's destined to align with big capitals. So this underdog posture of the convoy is really a subjective, effective crisis, I think. And the Freedom Convoy was never really a political challenge to the ruling class, because the petty bourgeoisie isn't a separate class interest from either the working class or capital. It's kind of an admixture, and in this case, its temperament is a symptom of a system in a downturn, if not decline. So This partial understanding, I think, feeds a lot of populist fantasies where the petty bourgeoisie is thought to be this kind of mercenary element floating between working and ruling classes and drifting in and out of line with one or the other, depending on economic and rhetorical persuasion. So people look at the contempt of the Freedom Convoy and the new far right for Trudeau, Liberals, and O'Toole, Tories alike, and think, what if we could win this discontent over? What if we could populate the slogan, fuck Trudeau, with like proper reasons, Isn't socialism for everyone? Maybe so, eventually. But socialism isn't for everything. You listen to Pat King go on about white genocide, you sift the xenophobic agenda of the Maverick or People's Parties, it's clear that their movement is violently, starkly exclusive, so we can't meet their reasons even halfway. What remains, I think, is to account for the racist fantasy of lost social cohesion that operates behind something as trifling as the vaccine mandate, and why this domestic lampoon of the kind of coup that Canada enthusiastically authorizes elsewhere in the world takes on a patriotic dimension in spite of its seditious intent. This isn't so much of a paradox because the new right isn't proposing a revolution, but a reclamation of what they perceive to be theirs. I remember Emily Riddle describing the Ottawa event as an occupation of an occupation, which I thought was apt. So I've spoken of how a proto-fascist tide is necessarily class collaborationist, enrolling sections of the working class alongside capital against their interests. But in accounting for the racial character of the convoy, I think it's important to note the racial character of the capitalist project in Canada more generally. Gerald Horne is writing about the United States, but it's very clear that the class collaboration of recent right-wing insurgencies takes place within and after the class collaboration of the colonial project. Horne describes how a racializing social order in North America subdues class antagonism within the settler population, where the negative identity of whiteness forged in anti-Blackness and colonial hierarchy rather than any objective cultural identity compels the identification of a European working class previously divided along ethnic lines with the ruling class. This pacification transpires in the form of what Du Bois called a psychological wage for European workers, right? An illusory superiority or false identity that can supplement immiseration, In Canada, you see this play out in campaigns to attract immigrants to the West on behalf of the financial interests who would eventually, really drive Confederation. Once the HBC pivots from fur trade to large-scale real estate acquisition and the railroad tears through Indigenous land, settlers are required to people this corporate land grab, and you see this idyllic literature, posters recruiting the right man to the right land and so on, produced in tandem with peasant farm policy that's shutting Indigenous people out of commercial agriculture and forcing them off their lands. So the frontier mentality of the West that's so crucial to Canadian identity formation not only reproduces an opposition between nature and homesteader and represses Indigenous occupancy, but it practically enlists settlers of pan-European provenance at the outskirts of a pretty exclusive club to this point, reserved for an Anglo-Saxon ruling class. This isn't to say that whiteness is class privilege as such, but in a colonial situation, it modifies property relations and affects mobility, and it alters the structure of the class society. Indigenous people are dispossessed militarily and bureaucratically, as non-European immigrants are denied franchise, and the affordances made for immigrants granted access to the wages of whiteness, even and especially as they work gruelingly hard, perhaps, and a large section of them endure hardships. It produces a meritocratic ideology that's basically racial at its basis, as well as being closely related to the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie with their self-earned wealth. This is not the same, but where you have both, you have the makings of a white nationalist movement defending their share of what's essentially stolen. So there's a large compendium of good writing on the historical ontology of race that I can't really even gloss now, but I'm personally attracted to a description descended from Harry Haywood and a particularly creative moment in the application of CPUSA line, that to the degree that race has a positive valence, it is a posit of racism. And otherwise, race is the negation of a culture and nation or nationality. And I think that I possibly prefer this description to some other influential accounts because it recommends a liberationist anti-racism rather than like a liberal progressive anti-racism. And furthermore, because this analytic of race really disqualifies whiteness as a cause, because whiteness is no kind of nation. White nationalism becomes apparent for the nonsense that it is. It's an oppressor ideology. So to the same degree, and I'll stop here, that the Convoy is kind of satirical of various emancipatory movements, obviously borrowing successful tactics from land defenders and anti-globalization activists and trade unionists and so on, for which they otherwise evince contempt. White nationalism appropriates language that could only be legitimate coming from the standpoint of the national oppressed. So one thing I'd offer is that as we think of strategies by which to confront the insurgent far right, we shouldn't underestimate our strength on the broad left, because this right-wing movement in many respects is adapting tactics from the same broad left and anti-colonial movements that their political bloc tried to criminalize just last year, logistical actions and so on. And their concepts and language are clearly a right-wing reply to some pretty successful attempts at consciousness raising around colonialism and anti-racism and so on. So in a way, because it's a reactionary movement, we are kind of already setting the terms of this confrontation where, even a heinous imperialist like Trudeau is disparaged as a communist for some reason in this right-wing imaginary. So fascism usually comes about as a reply to a proposed proletarian alternative. And though labor is politically weak at the moment, I don't relish that fact. I think it's fair to say that this particular fascist uptake is not only formed against recent crisis measures, but against some truly progressive developments in a cultural war of position. And where that's concerned, we should go further. Our defense against fascism should include an offensive against the cultures and the colonial relations that naturalize fascist explanations. So I'll stop there, but thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you very much, Cam. And I'll just remind people, there's a couple of questions that have trickled in. After Sarah presents, we'll turn it over to comments and questions. But so if anyone missed my brief introduction on the format, we will be taking questions and comments through the question and answer function. People won't be able to sort of verbally pose their questions or comments to Cam, Sarah, or myself. So please, if you've got some questions, type them and send them in to us. We're keeping an eye on the question and answer. And you'll also see in the chat, there's been a link to the groups that are supporting this event and articles by the authors as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce Sarah Jama. Sarah is the Executive Director at the Disability Justice Network of Ontario. She is a community organizer from Hamilton, Ontario, with Cerebral Palsy, who does work around combating anti-Black racism, policing, and housing insecurity. And through the Disability Justice Network, she works to tackle systemic ableism by building up capacity amongst disabled organizers to challenge structures locally, provincially, and nationally. And so with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name's Sarah. I live in Hamilton, Ontario. I feel like I do not read enough to follow whatever happened before me. I learned so much, so I'm still processing, but I got asked to talk about the links between eugenics ideology and the rise of the far right in Canada. So I'm going to do my best to do that now. So people with disabilities are continuously told through structural decisions and political influences that we do not have freedom to exist as individuals here. And there are links between ableism and colonialism over time. Through the transatlantic slave trade, we could see that this slave trade was created on the basis of othering Black people, their minds and their bodies, and framing Black people as others, as incompetent, and as not human. The diagnosing of Black people as having mental illnesses was prevalent when they were seeking freedom through this made-up illness called drapetomania. And so this is an example, an early example of how disability was used as a weapon of the state to try to control Black people. And we've seen this kind of continue throughout the rise of the medical industrial complex in history here in Canada. So I'm thinking about the Alberta Sterilization Act, a eugenics-based act in Canada and also mirrored in the States, where there were links between these structural decisions and decisions around eugenics that came out of Nazi Germany. So this Alberta Sterilization Act, based out of Nazi Germany and their policies there, basically said that disabled people and Indigenous people would be sterilized without their will, knowledge, or consent. Over and over again. These structural decisions particularly impacted people of color and Indigenous peoples. We also saw institutions across Canada, like the Huronia Aurelia Asylum for Idiots and the Feeble-Minded, come into existence that mirrored structures such as residential schools, where disabled people and their families were told to, send their disabled family members to these institutions, these schools, that existed across Canada in almost every province, where people were forcibly institutionalized under the guise of receiving proper healthcare and education. People were sexually, emotionally, and physically abused, and one of the largest grave sites that we know of in Ontario exists outside of the Aurelia Asylum, where over 1,000 bodies are buried, some without names, as they were just given numbers. And this institution sort of model followed the residential school system, where anybody who wasn't seen as cis white, able-bodied, who was seen as other, would be pushed into the outskirts of society and abused and taken advantage of in these buildings. And the last institution didn't really close until the early 90s, but they've existed in other forms. If you want to learn more about these institutions, you can look up Invisible Institutions. Megan Linton has a really cool podcast breaking them up. But our medical industrial complex and these systems continue until today to say that disabled people don't have the right to be free and equal and exist in Canada. And the government and the far right seem to be mobilizing around eugenics, while at the same time, the far right is protesting government policies that are supposed to allegedly protect disabled people. So examples of links between eugenics and disability and COVID are, for example, the triage protocols that came into place throughout the pandemic, where governments across Canada, different provincial governments, created protocols that said that if you're disabled, if you have a quote unquote comorbidity, which is just another term to say that someone has other disabilities or illnesses, you would receive less care than someone who is able-bodied who went into the hospital because you are seen as deserving less than an able-bodied person when we're in a crisis and when there's not enough equipment. We also saw over the course of the pandemic, the expansion of MAID, medical assistance in dying for disabled people. I'm pro-choice in life and in death, but the government specifically expanded medical assistance in dying for disabled people who are not terminally ill. So you have situations where across Canada, people are legislated below the poverty line. Social assistance rates are keeping disabled people in poverty. And in Ontario, for example, a wait list for getting access to a pain clinic in London, for example, can take up to 2 years. So you have people who can't afford food, can't afford rent, can't work, because a lot of disabilities actually stop people from being able to fit the common understanding of productivity, whatever that means. And so many people who are disabled can't work, are forced to live with poverty wages, who are now actually accessing medical assistance in dying, but who wouldn't have otherwise died. And we're seeing this over and over again. People are documenting their experiences on TikTok, on Twitter, online, and have been talking about how, they wouldn't have used MAID if they had the ability to survive as a disabled person in this country. And that expansion happened over the span of 18 months, which is almost unheard of for legislation such as that. We also saw over the course of the pandemic in Ontario a repeal of the Healthcare Consent Act. So normally when you go to a hospital and you're in need of care, for your care plan to change, so like if you're taken off a ventilator or if you're moved to a different hospital, you have to consent. And if you're not able to consent, your family has to consent. That Healthcare Consent Act was repealed, meaning that doctors could just make decisions. And so when you're looking at this from a perspective of like white supremacy in our medical industrial complex systems and the lack of training for doctors around combating racism and white supremacy within themselves, it's scary because it creates a condition where disabled people who are racialized, who are seen as less than by people of power in these positions, are putting their lives in the hands of people who could literally make any change without you consenting to it. We've also seen the understanding around the warehousing of disabled people grow over the course of the pandemic. So, and this means looking at long-term care homes and the conditions there. Over the course of the pandemic, the hardest hit population around COVID has been disabled people who are living in long-term care homes. And we've seen that been documented quite well by Nora Loretto and some other journalists. But what we've also seen is that like the focus on long-term care has been on the need to nationalize long-term care, but there hasn't really been the political breakdown of, why are we sending disabled people away, people who can't afford to participate in the workforce anymore, who are not able to? Why are we sending them away into these institutions that have caused harm? We know that, for example, over the course of the pandemic, people were removing doorknobs so that, people were trapped in their homes. We know that Chris Gladders, who was a person from Hamilton, actually, his family lives here. He was living in his feces and urine for weeks on his bed and then decided to access medical assistance and dying because the conditions of long-term care are such, they're so terrible and deplorable that, you don't have a choice over what you eat. You don't have a choice over when you change. You don't have a choice over your hygiene routine. It's technically the imprisonment of disabled people because our governments choose not to fund home care, palliative care, a guaranteed basic livable income, all the things that we would need for disabled people to be free and equal in the society. And so you have that, and then you had the focus on nationalizing instead of looking at the fact that there are many publicly owned long-term care homes that are also in terrible conditions. 90% of the long-term care homes in Quebec, for example, are publicly funded and still had some of the worst COVID rates, some of the worst treatment of disabled people. Many people would rather die than end up in a long-term care home, but rather than talking about alternatives to sending people away, these institutions continue to exist, and we have the so-called left calling for nationalizing of these warehoused homes. We also saw a couple years before the pandemic, the repeal of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project. The Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project was super important, especially here in Hamilton, where we have the highest population of disabled people in the province of Ontario. And with that pilot project, we were able to see disabled people actually afford to and be able to survive independently, be able to afford your medication and rent and food. And as soon as the Conservative government came in, that project was wiped away. So while we have like the white supremacists and the Convoy protesters saying that the vaccine shouldn't exist and that, they shouldn't have to be making changes for themselves to support disabled people in our communities, you have like a history through colonization and ableism, through the creation of the medical industrial complex, and through present day decisions through the pandemic that continue to say disabled people should be deprioritized or less than human and don't have the right to exist freely and have the right to survive or even afford basic necessities like food or clothing or shelter. So it's not a surprise that over the course of the rise of white supremacy, like the language of like, we don't need the vaccine, we should be able to care for ourselves, and who cares about disabled people and the needs of disabled people, has been on the rise and has been mirrored by government. We also see structural like ableism and violence by the way of funding. So I said that I'm pro-choice in life and in death, and I mean that. But we have to look at the choices that the government is making in terms of who gets to live and who doesn't. The funding of prenatal screening of Down syndrome, for example, has more investment nationally than the funding for the lives of adults with Down syndrome. And this is mirrored across almost every disability, by the way. There are more funding in terms of prenatal screening in children than the lives of adults with the same disability. You get cut off of most services by the time you turn 18. And if you don't have privatized healthcare in Canada, it's very hard to afford things like physiotherapy and a lot of other services that aren't always covered by OHIP and ODSP. And so these decisions to fund whether or not someone has the ability to live a quality of life is eugenics-based structural ableism, because it's deciding which populations get the chance to live and which don't. So again, the ideology of eugenics, like being centered by the far right, is not a surprise at all. Let's talk about police killings. We know about the killings of Abdurrahman Abdi, a Somali man with autism, Solomon Fakiri, a Muslim man with schizophrenia who was killed in the Lindsay, Ontario jail instead of, provided a hospital bed, which he was supposed to be taken to, but there were none available. Andrew Loku and so many more. Police have been allowed to kill and threaten, and I'm thinking about even during the pandemic, Ijaz Chowdhury, who was on a mental health call, Regis Paquette on a mental health call, DeAndre Campbell, he called the police himself for support like he normally and routinely did on a mental health call, and then ended up killed, right? Police have been allowed to kill Black and racialized disabled people very specifically, even throughout the BLM era where more people were paying attention to this. And it's because disabled and racialized people are seen as less than in our societies. And it's not a surprise that police also backed the convoy organizing and convoy messaging around getting back to normal and, the lack of need for vaccines. So to combat the far right, we need to understand critiques of capitalism if we really want to build a world where disabled people are free to exist. Capitalism creates an environment where those who are deemed as less productive are pushed out of the systems that are currently in place. So I'm thinking about like the seniors and people with disabilities who are working class and racialized. We need to create a society that believes that people have the right to exist regardless of their ability to fit modern understanding of ability to work, and move away from this idea that working class means people who are just working. Like there are many disabled people who can't work, who need to be also centered in this conversation, in these types of conversations. Looking at things like a tax on basic income, the slashing of ODSP, the lack of universal healthcare, even though we keep talking about it, it shows that these decisions by government are what has fueled eugenics-based ideology in people on the ground. Organizers who are doing work on various intersections that are issue-based need to get better at seeing common threads between movements. It's about time that we stop doing movement work based on just issues, and we need to be tying back our issues to a root cause. So combating capitalism and imperialism, because disabled people fit every race, religion, geographic location. We're the largest, for lack of a better term, like subsect of the population, but we're the most silent in terms of like the ways in which we're able to mobilize ourselves and included in movement spaces in order to mobilize against the state. Organizing has to be like a mandate. Political involvement has to be seen as a necessity, and people with disabilities have been very disenfranchised through non-profit structures that pit us against each other. So you have like the Cerebral Palsy Foundation, you have like Schizophrenia Society of Ontario. We need to be less focused on the issue itself and the type of disability, and more so working together to combat, eugenics-based policy that continue to come out locally, provincially, and federally. We need to come together to understand that the only way to win is to get political and to unite against common barriers and enemies outside of the nonprofit industrial complex. We also need a proper left-wing alternative for folks to believe in that isn't based in our current party structures. Because even our party structures, like if I'm talking about eugenics, like the NDP was terrible on their policies around medical assistance in dying. They're slow to talk about proper universal healthcare, and they continue to compromise. So if we're talking about, combating right-wing ideology and making sure to protect the most vulnerable in our communities, we need to be working outside of these structures and actually like going out to talk to disabled people and people who have been disenfranchised from these, you know, these conversations. I think that's mostly what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And that was really great. And together with Cam, and hopefully my introduction has given us a lot to really think about as we move into the question and answers for the rest of our time. And so we've got a fair bit of time. Some questions have come in. And so again, just to remind people, you can send your questions into the question and answer. Perhaps if you if you're thinking of a specific presenter you're posing a question to, then of course you can identify that person. Otherwise, I'll pose the question to all presenters, and you know, if they can choose to address the question if they feel comfortable to do so. And again, just a reminder too, and I know that it's kind of it's a challenge to bracket off discussions. And so I recognize that it's hard to have any kind of conversation about the context and not want to start thinking about how do we respond to this. And so I'm not trying to suggest that we shouldn't talk about that at all. But there will also be some other questions. And so I'm just as a gentle reminder to everyone to not have this conversation now, but just as a reminder, on May 7th, we're going to also have a meeting specifically on building a movement against the far right's resurgence, and what are the kinds of tactics, strategies, and key organizing questions and that are involved in doing that. So I'll just note that. So if you have more questions and comments, folks, please send them in. So here's a question to start. Is an abolitionist approach against policing, prisons, and carceral relations not central to fighting the far right and fascists? And maybe I'll just add, could you understand it as central to understanding the growth of the far right? Has it the carceral kind of world in which we live, the violent racist policing and so on, is it connected in some way? Does it provide a platform, or these like separate phenomena? So in any case, but the question was, does abolitionist approach, is it central to fighting the far right? So if Sarah and Cam would like to jump in, and I'll just remind you to unmute yourself first.
Yeah, I think, yeah, because it was very clear that the police were backing the Convoy protesters, and that wasn't a surprise to anybody who's been paying attention to policing. Police exist to protect the state. They don't exist to protect any of us. And so if we're going to move toward really combating the far right, we need to, one, learn how to protect each other outside of relying on the state, and understand that government too will always stand with police. So we can't rely on government either to actually combat, you know, white supremacy and the growth of it. The choice for government to sort of, you know, give police a bunch of powers, right, and to pass legislation only for us to later find out that police already knew that this protest was going to exist, was a joke. Like, while people were protesting in Ottawa, a bunch of my friends and I across Canada were dealing with charges for doing stuff as simple as, you know, protecting tenants from evictions, right? And it goes to show that police protect their own interests. They lie, they cheat, they will harm, and they will kill if we allow them to do so. So we can't, like, there was a lot of rhetoric around, like, why aren't the police doing anything? We don't want the police to do anything. We can't rely on them to do that, because while we're calling for them to do that, somewhere else across Canada, they're causing harm and killing people, right? They will never be the solution. And so we need to be abolitionists, and we need to understand how to protect ourselves, which I don't think we talk about enough. on the so-called left? Like, how do we actually protect each other outside of mutual aid? Like, what are we willing to do to protect each other from the state? Because some of us continue to be brutalized over and over again before the convoy and after. So how are we going to protect each other? And what are the ways we're actually going to show up when it counts to protect each other? Those conversations need to be centered outside of policing.
Thank you. Cam, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I firmly second all of that. I think that confronting policing and the security apparatus in Canada is absolutely central to any anti-fascist movement. And I think that Sarah, just now, but also in your presentation, I think you did a fantastic job describing how a lot of the social and political institutions of capitalism are latently or explicitly racist, ableist, and so on. And this is before the fascist sympathies that are well documented among police and security forces, that a lot of the systems that they uphold actually their functioning accords pretty well with the stated goals of fascists too, so I think abolitionist movements have some far-reaching insights into not only how deeply far-right ideology has already penetrated police, and the close accord of these movements and and law enforcement, but also alternatives to the everyday cultures of capitalism that are plausibly proto-fascist in their present application. A lot of the work I do with Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, our vision of anti-fascism starts before any particular insurgency, and it has to do with confronting the police, which are this supposedly legitimate institution of civil society that acts in a flagrantly racist, prejudicial manner in our communities every day.
Thank you. So another question. Can you speak to the levels of vaccine hesitancy in Indigenous, Black, and other non-white communities due to long-term mistrust of a colonial white supremacist health system?
Yeah, I think I can do that. But before I get into that, I want to talk about the ways in which public health has failed in terms of their due diligence to reaching out to Black and Indigenous people. So in Hamilton, it took us 8 months to push our municipality to prioritize Black and racialized people. And yet we were the first municipality to do that in Ontario. And Black and racialized people have been able to run our own vaccine clinics. And we've been able to get vaccines to thousands upon thousands of racialized people. And we did that by pressuring, public health did not want to do the simplest tasks, such as taking the Statistics Canada data in terms of where people live in our city based on race, and crossing that with income levels and the level of the number of high rises in our community. And so the very same high rises that we were able to map out as probably going to have outbreaks, they did have outbreaks. And so public health was not willing to have those conversations. Instead, they were talking about how do we increase security and policing and the lineups in certain areas. And, Black and racialized people are hesitant. So how do we reach out to them versus just providing the clinics? Why were the very first clinics offered on the mountain in very affluent areas here in Hamilton? There's a reason for that. So yeah, while people are hesitant, it's also because there's been a lack of information and care in terms of communicating to Black and racialized people about how to get a vaccine, where and when. Very intentionally, people were excluded. Yes, people have a hesitancy, perhaps because of the medical system is racist, right? Vaccines have been tested on Black and Indigenous people over and over again. This isn't new information, and have caused a lot of harm. And there's no surety that this won't happen again. But what I will say is public health also just didn't care to put extra effort in, at least in Hamilton, to reach out to Black and racialized people. And it was a long fight. We actually had to, like, a bunch of us created a Google form. We kind of did this like illegally. And we said, like, if you want a vaccine and you're Black and racialized, fill out this Google form. Then we went back to public health and we said, a bunch of people, look, 1,000 people filled this out. They want the vaccine. They're not hesitant. So stop talking to us about hesitancy and just provide the fucking clinic. And so, yeah, there are issues and barriers in terms of why people don't want to go forward with vaccines. And I understand that too. But let's not allow, like, the government and, like, white people in these positions to provide the clinics to be using that language. That should come from us. It should come from Black and Indigenous people. If we're hesitant, we'll talk about it. But the people in power who have the ability to provide the vaccines should not be using that frame of reference, because it's going to leave people out. And that was the intention behind that, in my opinion.
Ken, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I think this is a crucial question. Again, I agree with all of that, as Sarah discussed. You know, many of the ways in which the colonial state has administered to Indigenous and Black communities and people of color, it's been abusive and eugenicist, and there's a traumatic legacy that resonates through generations. So, to the degree that this incredulity of state administered care is based in real experience of colonial violence and, you know, like racist terror in a sense, really, like what else would you call it? I think it should be treated differently than a movement of the religious right for bodily autonomy, say, right? Which particularly when you weigh it against the demands of disabled people in a pandemic, you know, this talk of bodily autonomy and so on, again, Sarah spoke to this so expertly, is just farcical. One of the compelling arguments against the vaccine mandate, you know, because truthfully, if it weren't a euphemism for a mobilization of the far right, we could examine the propositions of the Freedom Convoy concerning the mandate, right? One of the compelling arguments you could make against the vaccine mandate, it has nothing to do with the fact that the vaccine saves lives. Evidently it does. But it was a plausible austerity device to force people back to badly waged work. And it was never intended holistically to address vaccine equity or reach into unwaged surplus populations, let alone like racialized communities who are unduly impacted by COVID-19. So on one hand, the convoy, I think, was happy to claim to represent these legitimate hesitancies, Pat King especially. But Canada's vaccine strategy is shamefully slight on education and outreach. It was always intended, I think, first and foremost, as an amenity to like re-enfranchise the enfranchised, you know? And this is even connected to our inability to follow through on our commitment to the COVAX program and global vaccine apartheid too. You know, it's all of a piece. So it's too bad that given that this was all about vaccines, the convoy failed to thematize any of this to even the slightest degree. It's not surprising, but it's shameful.
Thanks. So there's a more of a historical question, which if either of you want to take a stab at, the question is, fascists seem more organized in Quebec. So in the 1930s, the movement around wasn't just around Arconne was one of the larger concentrations in North America. And in the most recent period, like 2016 to 2018 or so, the fascist groups in Quebec probably could mobilize more than elsewhere, perhaps with the United We Rural Convoy as an exception. But in any case, so the question was, fascists seem more organized in Quebec. What are the historical roots for this? I'm putting you a bit on the spot here, either of you. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that. And if you don't, that's totally fine, because there might also be someone in the discussion who could also could type into the question and answer if they have thoughts on that. So I don't know if either of you would like to speak to that.
What I'll say immediately is that I don't know a lot about the present situation in Quebec. and I don't want to draft, large theses that I wouldn't be able to fill out. Certainly, there's a long history dating back to Arcan, and I'm, somewhat familiar with that. Elsewhere in Canada too, talking to comrades in Quebec, I am aware of the frightening gains of the far right there as well. Perhaps the only thing that I would add is that there's a further degree to which white nationalism is kind of a misnomer, because it's not only that whiteness isn't a nation, but that all of these national isolationist, white supremacist projects, they're all working pretty closely together, and they're all sharing resources and membership, and they're quite coordinated and networked and so on. So I don't suppose that the fascist gains made in Quebec are terribly separate of Canada-wide and a global white supremacist movement that's quite networked. But I shouldn't speculate as to its specificity, because I just don't know.
I don't know if you want to jump in, Sarah. I have a couple thoughts as well. No. So one thing that helped the fascists, it didn't create them by any means, and they're already big at this point, but I mean, it helps when you're getting money from a mainstream political party, the Conservative Party, whose leader would be the Prime Minister, Bennett. And I probably just tied to the Quebec national question, where you have, particularly at that time, going back to the 30s, the Catholic Church plays a much stronger role in Quebec society, and Canada was born. Quebec obviously comes into Canada because it's sort of New France is conquered by the British, and Canada was a fairly strong, at times militant outpost of conservative Anglo-British, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant politics. Like Toronto, up until after the Second World War, was referred to as Little Belfast. Little Belfast, or that was the title, something Belfast. And a group that doesn't normally get discussed within the discussions of fascism, but which deserves to be, not because it was fascist, but there's overlap. There is the Orange Order, and it was a major political force in Ontario, at least, as a very white Anglo-Saxon militant pro-British Empire politics. And also people who from time to time would get drunk and go out and do kind of fascistic-y style beating up people they didn't like, Catholics, Jews, other immigrants, and so on. But that's not usually discussed in the context of fascism. So just to balance that question out, it's true, the Quebec fascists are quite large, but if you can kind of at least consider in some ways the Orange Order in the equation, it balances out, I think, a little bit. And of course, I don't want to single out Quebec for Islamophobia, because it's across the country, but there's clearly strong streaks within elements of Quebec society, and I think that also opens the space for groups like the sort of far right groups that formed in the last several years. So that would be my quick answer to that question. Thank you for that question. Sorry, we can't maybe give you more to the questioner substance than that. So another question, how do we reconcile the Canadian government's, regardless of the party that's in power, attempt to distance itself from fascist local groups or fascistic local groups, which is they did during the Convoy, while they enact colonial fascism on this land, and while they unconditionally support fascistic states like Israel? How do we use this moment to denormalize the Canadian state? So a lot packed into that question. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that, Sarah or Cam.
Stop asking the government to fix the issue. Stop asking the police to get involved. The 2 weeks online of people being like, why aren't the police doing anything? Emboldened random random powers to be given to the police that literally did nothing, and emboldened CSIS, and emboldened, people in positions of power who could have done more, who could have said more, who chose not to. So let's stop turning to them for solutions and stop turning to the cops for solutions. Unfortunately, it appears to me, maybe this isn't true, that the right wing, at least they're able to talk to each other. At least they get into rooms and talk to each other. With us, we debate online. over the tiniest thing. It's like, oh, someone's doing a counter protest, don't do that. Oh wait, you should do the counter protest. Like, now's not the time to be publicly debating those tactics. We should have had it lined up before that, right? And so how can we get into a room as so-called leftists across Canada and just meet and come up with tactics and share solutions and figure out and map out next steps? I think, rather than relying on government or responding to government every time they do something fucked up that we know they're going to do anyway. I think we have a problem of not being able to talk to each other, but maybe I'm just reducing the issue to something small. I don't know. I'm not like a theorist. This is just what I'm seeing. I don't know, but that's what I see as an issue.
I am here for the broadest possible cooperation. I love it. There's a few things kind of as you said, traversing that question. First of all, I think it's really worthwhile if we're talking about fascism historically, or giving kind of a genetic account of fascism, to point up that a lot of the Europe, there's numerous ways we could approach this question. A lot of the European fascisms, a lot of their racialist policies were, modeled after the colonial apparatus as it was honed in North America, right? So, to a degree, practices of the Canadian state are actually in some way fundamental to, or have been motivating of, fascism. Also, if you look at fascism of what we might call the neo-liberal era, and I try to use that word with some specificity, it's a period of all kinds of fascist coups and destabilizations throughout the Americas and so on. These were all pretty enthusiastically backed by the advanced capitalist countries with their colonial history and so on. And Canada's been complicit in any number of these ongoingly. So absolutely. I mean, we enthusiastically back all kinds of plausibly fascist governments and militias and so on all over the world. And this is something that the Canadian state has no moral authority on. The last question, denormalizing the Canadian state, that's a big project that I should like to push further. But I agree with Sarah. Don't call the cops. Don't accept. As the NDP provisionally accepted the extension of the Emergencies Act. Things we haven't spoken about today yet. This is the sort of crisis measure that will absolutely be wielded against the broad left. If you look at the application of the Emergencies Act, it's a rebranding of war measures, because people didn't want war measures to be enacted domestically. But if you read it chapter and verse, it's very similar to these previous war measures acts that have been used to illegalize the party to which I belong. If you look at a lot of the moments in which the Canadian state has passed war measures acts ostensibly to combat fascism, they've really only been used to prosecute and incarcerate anti-fascists. So I don't think we should trust the Canadian state to wield this power. It's hardly an exceptional power if you look at its practical operation.
Thanks. I'll just add one quick point too, with respect to that question is, I mean, I don't think we should be surprised that the Liberal Party or a party in government might distance itself from the far right in this particular moment, because the Canadian, the far right is, it's grown. It doesn't have like any kind of, at this point, critical strength. I don't wish to trivialize it. It's just, and the crisis, while real, the wider societal capitalist crisis, while real, is not nearly at a stage where ruling class figures tend to turn to street-based movements because they can't bring order themselves. And so, if you look at, like, for example, the Nazis and earlier iterations of them, as well as other far-right paramilitaries that operated in Germany after the First World War, they weren't initially seen when they organized as the Nazis as aligned with the German ruling class, even if there was a precursor called the Freikorps that they used to crush the German Revolution. But in any case, they were seen as kind of like, these are the, as I said earlier, the kind of boorish, crude types that we don't want anything to do with. They're kind of an embarrassment. And it was when they needed to turn to them after they had grown, of course, in size, is when they needed to turn to them that they sort of oriented to them. But prior to that, there was some, even though there was overlap with some government and military officials, of course, and fascists, there wasn't like an immediate identification with them. It takes a degree of growth of power in the street of fascists on the one hand, and a level of crisis that the bourgeoisie can't resolve through either like traditional parliamentary means, as was the case in Germany, or through the military, which is also the case in Germany, because they couldn't rely on the military. So they turned to a sort of independent paramilitary force, which of course had overlaps with the military. So I think in terms of like, we shouldn't be surprised that Canada distanced itself from fascists here while engaging in all sorts of violence, whether you want to call fascist or not, overseas, including supporting coups and so on, or right here at home where it can exercise and has the capacity to exercise power through the RCMP or the military to dispossess Indigenous peoples in the way of a pipeline. But in terms of like fascists taking over Ottawa, well, they're going to, which as Cam pointed out, that was kind of the goal that they had, even though they kind of seemed absurd in how they went about it. But like, the Liberal Party doesn't want them to take over Ottawa, and the bourgeoisie doesn't either, because the bourgeoisie is right now getting kind of most of what it wants out of the Liberal Party. Okay, so another question. This one is specifically for Sarah. It says, thanks so much, Sarah, for highlighting the eugenic, anti-disabled, and racist organization by state agencies in public health of the pandemic. Did the lack of an effective critical response from the left, unions, and our social movements provide an opening for the far right to grow in the context of the pandemic? And so also, I'll just add, Sarah, like you made that important connection between the history of eugenics widely and within the far right, and, anti-vax politics, kind of being eugenicist, right? Which, as our questioner points out, wasn't really challenged in that particular way, or maybe at all. So how do you see in response to that, that kind of weakness in response in the sort of eugenicist, more broadly kind of politics out there, feeding into the far right in its growth?
Yeah, Labor has an issue of not interrogating these topics at all either. Like, the rights of workers who are injured are not covered under the Canada Health Act. And so you have injured workers who are disabled, who are forced to defend their rights for compensation in tribunals across Canada. And unions also, during the time of, disabled people like yelling and screaming about the ways in which they're being left to die during the pandemic, have gone so far as just to say that, they need wages for personal support workers, which wages are important, obviously, but what about the people who are being mistreated in the long-term care homes or being left to die in the long-term care homes? Whether or not, like, increased wages don't fix the issue there, right? And so over and over again, the topics that are being covered by those on the so-called left have left disabled people out, and I think it did create room for white supremacists and for the Convoy protesters to continue that and to say, look, we are for the people want to be free and return back to normal. Disabled people should just stay in their houses and be locked away. That wouldn't have happened if we had proper disability theory-based conversations on the left in terms of how can unions support disabled people who maybe don't even work, right? Why do you need to be a worker in order to have rights or to be protected by so-called institutions like labor on the left? And it's these lack of conversations that have created a vacuum and room for white supremacists to be able to say, yeah, you know, even they're not saying like disabled people matter. We can say this too, right? If we had all been unified from the jump and said, no, we need guaranteed basic livable income, people have the right to survive, the long-term care homes should be abolished because it's akin to our carceral system, right? Megan Linton has done a lot of research in terms of like even the food that's offered in long-term care homes are the very same food that's offered in our prison institutions across Ontario, and the links there can't be denied. And yet we've talked about abolition in terms of carceral systems like prisons, but not carceral systems around like long-term care homes and where disabled people are left out. And so we do need to be doing a better job on the left to be supporting folks who are disabled, especially those who are not working and are not, maybe wouldn't identify as part of the working class simply because they don't work. And, you know, people aren't going out of their way to say, no, disabled people matter and are part of like these communities and should be organizing too. Like I saw videos of disabled people at the Convoy protest, which was really messed up because like there's also spectrum of privilege in terms of disabilities, right? And who's harmed the most and who's immunocompromised and who's not when we're talking about going back to normal and getting rid of vaccines. Anyway, all that to say, like, yeah, I think that if we were stronger on the left in terms of talking about disability and those who are harmed by our medical systems, our prison systems, and the links there, we would have come out stronger against and educated people more on the right in terms of like disability rights and what that means, instead of letting them co-opt, you know, co-opt these languages and say that like disabled people don't matter either way. There's not really a political home for disabled people at the moment because we've not been talking about these things as linked to like a history of colonialism and you know, integral to the fight against white supremacy.
Thank you. I'm also just going to note for everyone, speakers and attendees, the time. So we still have a pretty good number of participants, and there's still a few other questions. So so if it's okay, of course, people who are attendees don't have to stay, but it'd be lovely if you did, and we're still part of this conversation. But for Cam and Sarah, I'd like to just pose a few more questions, if that's okay. One question is, comment and a question. Although the base of the far right is small business and other middle class elements, we shouldn't underestimate its ability to appeal to some working class people today on specific issues, as we saw with the Convoy. Could you speak to why this is? If either of you would like to jump in.
I mean, I think that's a great question. I could jump in a little bit because this is the most important thing, I think, for the left to contend with, and this difficulty has tempted, I think, some of the more dangerous proposals, you know, that it would be possible for a broad working class movement to kind of recruit from some of the discontent comprising the Convoy, you know. And I think that this is why I've preferred, or I found it clarifying, to think of some of the energies traversing the Convoy as class collaborationist, you know, because there hasn't, I suppose, been a successful fascist movement, though these are movements of capital that hasn't had to recruit from the working class and offer, you know, what are in essence wrong solutions to real problems. So I think, again, unswervingly and without giving any credence to the paranoia and the conspiracism and the prejudice and the customary scapegoats that proliferate in the imaginary of the convoy. I think that we need to articulate a really, really clear, perspicacious vision for emancipation and for a broad class-based movement against capital as a racist social order. I think that we don't need to accept the self-opinion of the convoy, as a workers' movement, to speak to the workers within it by staying on topic and making really, really robust demands upon the state, building alternatives as we do, that are based in real working class demands. Like as all of the significant unions in all of the impacted sectors, pretty much the entirety of organized labor pointed out, for a purportedly working class movement, or for a working class movement that attracted a lot of working class sympathy, the convoy didn't talk about wages. It didn't talk about the fact that the trucking industry has, I believe I read, one of the highest workplace safety violation rates of any industry. It didn't address wage theft, overwork, the concerns of a very largely racialized workforce. A lot of the people who were excluded from the imaginary of the Freedom Convoy, which again, included very few truckers, and certainly those were not among the organizers. There were people calling this out. The industry is it 1/5 South Asian, and this was not very well represented at all on the face of it. So I think that it's a very partial representation of a fraction of the working class who, for whatever reason, have entered into orbit of these reactionary ideas. But so long as we can articulate a clear alternative and build power that grants nothing to these racist logics, I think that this is what I mean when I describe this war of position that we're involved in fighting, and that our defense against fascism also must include an offensive against capitalism as intrinsically reactionary.
Thanks. I don't know, Sarah, if you wanted to say no. Okay. I'll just add to just on Cam's last point, because I'm in Toronto. The Peel region, which is just adjacent to Toronto, it's kind of partly between Toronto and Hamilton, actually. There's been a campaign for several years now amongst truckers, a very racialized working class community, around unpaid wages, among other abuses. And that was, yes, was not represented at all in the so-called trucker movement. And I think that's worth considering, because there actually is a trucker movement that has been going on for years. That gets lost in these discussions. Okay, so here's a comment. It's not a question. I should have read it earlier. I'll just very quickly read it for everyone's benefit. I think it's in relationship to the question and our discussion on Quebec. Was, in addition to the more typically visible and active far right in Quebec, you also have the controversy of the Eastern Métis. Some white Quebecois and far right circles have claimed this identity in order to, and this is in quotes, to become native and claim land, etc. So that was posted. So to whomever posted that, thank you for that important reminder. So another question is, what are the implications? What are the implications of the US elements now tied materially to strong actors in the truckers' convoy, financially, if not socio-relationally? So I think they're referring to financing or funding through various public crowdsourcing websites. So what are the implications of US elements now tied materially to strong actors in the truckers' convoy? Does this, or has this lent a different level of organization militancy or ideology to the organizations we've historically seen on this soil. I don't know if anyone, I can just say a quick comment on this, just a caution to folks. Obviously, there was a lot of money that came from the United States, but we don't want to let any, we don't want to be mistaken to think that there isn't a Canadian-based, Canadian-rooted, and Canadian-supported and financed far right here, because most of the funding actually did come from Canadians and actually like the sort of middle class petty bourgeois element, which is not to say there wasn't American funding and there aren't connections between the far right in the US and Canada, and historically there most certainly has been. But I just, we don't want to, because so that was a narrative in the media amongst some, left nationalists who want to sort of says, well, this isn't really Canada, that kind of Canadian exceptionalism that we should be very critical of. So I'll just point that out. But I don't know if Cam or Sarah, you want to offer any comments on the impact of American funding for the Convoy and the far right in Canada.
I would say that I was disappointed that the NDP's language early on, the most forceful language that they mustered, was to denounce this as a foreign-backed movement. This is on one hand totally inadequate to address homegrown fascism, and what I hope to point out, the roots of this fascist tide in the Canadian social fabric, and in the political cultures of Canada as it already exists. And this is kind of a staple move, if you look at the way that some of their communications confront the housing crisis. They're the strongest language that they muster is about cracking down on foreign ownership of real estate in coastal cities or something like that. And it's totally inadequate to confront Canadian capitals, and it's a bit of a red herring, I think. But the other thing I would point out, this connects to what I was saying earlier, is that these fascist movements that profess, white nationalism and so on, they really are internationalist movements in terms of their coordination. The January 6th movement in the United States against the Capitol, people were pointing out that received a lot of money from Europe and so on. So people on the far right are massively coordinated, and this isn't a project that is restricted to any particular geography, I think, because of the global scale of capitalism. And this is a reactionary crisis tendency imminent to capitalism. So I think it's quite international from the outset, as well as being our problem.
Sarah, I wasn't sure if you want to jump in there or if I should go to another question.
No, I think that covered it.
And I'm just going to note too for everyone, there are several more questions, and at some point we're going to have to stop. And so I'll just, we'll do our best here to get to all the questions, and maybe I will and our speakers will just be cognizant of trying to get as many questions in as we can. And I just noticed, so this is a question I think it will be for Sarah probably. I recently read some of Marta Russell's Disability and Capitalism, where she argues, among much else, that while impairments are prior to disability, the latter, disability, is constructed as a category by capitalists/society to exclude too expensive workers who could work if adequately accommodated, but also allows for disability to be used as a cudgel against more abled workers if they step out of line. Finally, she argues that disability becomes further narrowed in times of crisis as well. So even the access to the meager sub-poverty government benefits are more difficult to get. It seems to me we see this is happening now with COVID too. I'd love to hear any of the presenters' thoughts on this reading. And so again, I'll just note a few other questions we want to get to as well, but do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I read some of that too. I think I kind of disagree with some of her takes in the sense that I think that some disabled people can't work and that's okay. Like, why are we so fixated on making it so that everybody can do some kind of work that's profitable? I don't, like, who cares? Like, some people can't and that should be allowed. Like, but I don't know. Yeah, we definitely saw that, especially like prior to the pandemic, like right before when the Ford government was into power, there were slashes to OW and ODSP, but also like he offloaded a lot of the responsibilities on for like provincially, municipally. So like individual caseworkers can decide who to reject and who to approve when it comes to ODSP, and like that's different than the standardized approval rate. So it's scary because if you have a particularly ableist worker and you know that like when you're on OW or ODSP, your worker changes every couple of weeks so that you don't build a relationship with them. If they don't understand your particular disability or your particular need, it's a lot harder to get access to certain supports, and it's getting harder and harder to apply and get approved. We see the same thing with like assistive devices. It takes like 6 to 8 months to get approved if you apply for a new piece of technology. And if you are working, you have to pay a percentage of that out of pocket. Sometimes it's easier to just try to find the money for the full amount, which is super expensive. So yeah, she definitely has a point in terms of the ways in which the state weaponizes disability against us, and uses it to, you know, show able-bodied people what they shouldn't aspire to be, even though the leading cause of disability in Canada is old age and we're all going to be disabled somehow. Like, we are held up as like the standard to not meet like the group of people you don't want to be, and it's shown through the way that disabled people are treated, those who can work and also those who can't work or choose not to, because disability, like, let's be clear, work is disabling, work disables people, and so it should be okay for people to also choose not to work in the way our current society is built. Like, for many people, work even exacerbates current disabilities. And so I think, yeah, we should be pushing for a guaranteed basic livable income, and everybody should be able to survive regardless of or not if they're working.
Thank you. I'm just going to push on to another question that both of you can, if you wish to answer. The convoy and occupation gained national attention, introducing peoples to symbols of hate and far-right networks like Diagolon and the COVID-19 conspiracy movement as a vehicle for the far-right. What do you think of the net result of the sudden broader attention? Has it improved openness to analyzing and responding to the far-right, or is it just platforming and spreading their narratives when publicized without any context? For example, we've seen parody and callouts of false dog whistles proliferate. Are we further ahead by these ways of drawing national attention to the far right? I think you'd like to jump in?
What I would quickly say is that one thing that I think that we should be very careful about, we should be a double-edged sword, always confronting the far right, as well as a pretty unhelpful sort of liberal bourgeois horror at this excrescence, you know? And a lot of the ways in which the far right has been reported on, I think, are not helpful, because the angle is that, oh, these this excrescent, horrible movement, the problem with it is its extremity vis-a-vis civil society, you know? And implicit in a lot of this reporting is a status quo, you know, is a defense of a status quo that's really in different ways and by different means also, you know, racist, classist, organized entirely for capital accumulation and so on. So I think that a lot of the reporting that is merely sensational is of a liberal provenance, and it's people who are both titillated and flummoxed by this thing that they don't even have the resources to understand. So I think that we need to muster, a really, really robust anti-racist, clear-minded, radical kind of resistance to this. That the media, the media as it seizes upon this moment hasn't really been kind to the anti-fascist organizing and the counter-protesters either. It's I think that I'm not sure that it's making the right, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little. I'm not sure that it's making the right stronger or exaggerating their power, but it certainly isn't even correctly characterizing their aims or provenances, and there's nothing actionable within it.
Sarah, did you want to jump in on this question? No. I did it. I was muted. A short question. Any concern about the Pierre Poilievre campaign? So running for the Conservative Party. I think he's the front runner right now, I think. And he was a supporter of the Convoy, met with convoys, protesters, and so on. And in fact, I think he was the one who did an interview with, I don't know if it's a swastika or some far rightist, like very clear, unambiguous far rightist flag behind him while he was doing it. Anyways, are there any concerns about him courting far right supporters in his campaign for the Conservative Party? Yeah, any thoughts?
We shouldn't really pay too much attention to what these guys are doing. I don't like, they're going to do it anyway, like whether or not this convoy protest happened and we saw this man in front of that flag, he already espoused these ideologies. And so there's not too much we can do if the state itself is not like bothering to reprimand its own people in positions of power to stop being shitheads. There's not too much that we can do because we're not in power. Instead, we should focus on how to organize ourselves outside of these systems and understand that people like him are not a surprise, and people like him are going to continue to use systems that exist and leverage powers that he can to build the movements in the ways that he knows how. So we just need to be focused on ourselves and what we're going to be doing to protect our own people.
Cam, any thoughts?
Well, I think that the presently existing conservatives are a very, very uneasy alliance of, like big and small capitals and so on. And if anything, I certainly agree with Sarah. We should be building power that really brooks no compromise with, these parliamentary representations, but at the same time, I think that it's good to observe some of these things that are going on because we can maybe exploit the divisions that appear within the right. This is an extremely fractious alliance at the moment. O'Toole was basically, I suppose, in this formation representing the interests of the high bourgeoisie, supported the mandates and lost a lot of his base. He was campaigning a little bit to the center, still an absolutely vile, irredeemable person. I'm glad to see the back of him, but I don't think that this new, I think that there is a further right that's ascendant within the ranks of the Conservative Party, but it's going to splinter because of it. And I don't think that they're especially electable. And I'm more concerned about the street level manifestations that this stuff is kind of indexical of, I'm more concerned about the would-be militiamen and so on. The People's Party, I don't think that they will ever have a significant parliamentary presence, but they have been a pretty reliable index of a growing right that is endangering people where they live.
Thank you. I'm just noting the time, and there's several questions that we're going to get to, but I'm going to pose two more very quick questions, and I'll just ask for very quick responses before I thank everyone and we take our leave. And so I thought this is an important question. It hasn't really been part of our discussion, and it's worth just like thinking about very quickly. What sorts of distinctions can be drawn between the rural far right and the urban far right? Do you have any sense of the numbers and how they compare? So again, I'll just ask very quickly if you have any, either of you have any quick thoughts on it.
I think that to some degree this might, this is highly anecdotal. I don't really have a sense numerically of the balance. I think that that question requires a sort of class analysis. If we're talking about how a petty bourgeoisie, some people with, kind of self-earned property and so on, drift in and out of alignment with monopoly capital and so on, in and out of crisis. I think that this might also map onto what I was just talking about the fractures within the right, the fractures within not only the Conservative Party, but between different, not different class interests per se, but different class emphases within the right, I think that the really important thing about the Freedom Convoy is it enjoys the reputation of being, how to say, this underdog representing kind of like a rural or at least Western, it's from this Western secessionist kind of articulation, movement against like Eastern metropolitan elites and so on. It's just euphemism upon euphemism. But if you follow the money, if you look at the connections, in the final instance, these are pretty tightly unified interests. Ultimately, it's a division of labor. Some people are in the streets, and some people are organizing by these means, and other people, are pushing this agenda in Parliament and in those other settings. Yeah.
Sarah, did you want to add anything to that rural urban? I'll just say that numbers on supporters of the People's Party, that's, as Cam said, an index, not the measure for the far right, clears they were most effective in rural ridings over urban ridings. So that's one thing to just keep in mind. And Cam mentioned the sort of the Wexit stuff, and historically I think that's also true as well, like Reform Party starting out west, Social Credit also starting in Alberta, but we don't want to lose sight of it's not simple, obviously a rural phenomena, although clearly like there is probably some thinking to do there in terms of ruralness and sort of like whiteness in the rural areas. Again, not to say that's not an urban issue as well, but it's just in terms of you track the People's Party, there's clearly some connection going on there. Okay, and then the last question I'll pose, and again, we'll just mindful of the time, very quick here, and I apologize to everyone who submitted questions we're not getting to. Disinformation, vaccine related and otherwise, played a huge role in the convoy's formation. Do you have suggestions for how to confront disinformation, both organic, I think they mean outside the state, grassroots maybe, and that originating from state-sponsored operations? So do you have any like quick thoughts perhaps on confronting disinformation? And because clearly it has played a role around the COVID and the far right. So Sarah?
Just talk to your neighbors, right? Stop spending so much time on Twitter and on the internet. If you're worried about really combating disinformation, like can you talk about who your neighbors are, what's going on in your local communities, like what needs need to be met? Like we can talk about combating misinformation, but like are you also trying to meet people's material needs? Because once you do that, people are more open to listening to you about like how they're thinking. But most of the time, people are just frustrated because they're living in poverty or they're struggling to get by and will fall in line with like problematic ideology because those are the first people to like listen to them. We're stuck on Twitter. We're stuck talking to our friends and the 10 or 20 people that already agree with us. And so, yeah, getting out of that habit would be a start.
Cam, any last kind of quick words on this?
I think that's beautifully put.
Thanks very much. So I just want to thank everyone who attended today, participated just by virtue of being here. Of course, those who asked questions or made comments. And a special thanks to Sarah and Cam for joining us today. It's very much appreciated. Hopefully this has been a helpful discussion and the start of, or one start of, our collective efforts to build the response to the far right's obviously resurgent project. As a reminder, our second event again is on May 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern time, and it will be a meeting to discuss strategies on how to organize to stop the rise of the far right. And so there are a number of questions in the discussion that we're sort of gesturing at that. And I prioritized other questions precisely because we're having this meeting on the May 7th. So I apologize to folks that we didn't really get into that discussion, but the reason was because we're planning on having the meeting on the 7th as a follow-up to this one. This is the first part of the second part, first of a two-part. So where we will explicitly be taking up questions around strategy, tactics, and what is the movement that what kind of movement do we need to fight the rise of the far right? What does it look like and how can we build it? And what are its strategies and tactics? And so more details on that meeting will come out. We'll send everyone who signed up for today's event a notification about the May 7th event. And of course, we will send it out far and wide on social media. So please have a look out for it and share it. And we very much appreciate that. And hopefully you'll show up. And so once again, thanks to everyone who came. Thanks to Sarah and Cam. And I hope you all have a good rest of your Saturday. Take care, everyone.